Welcome, and thanks for joining me. We will be discussing the cognitive load theory, as well as the cognitive theory of multimedia learning today. My name is Kim. So let's talk first about the cognitive load theory. Now there are two components that we will be talking about. They are the load conditions, and they are the cognitive architecture. So let's start with the cognitive architecture first. So the cognitive architecture consists of the working memory, schemas, and the long-term memory. And we'll talk briefly about each one of these components. So the working memory is probably something we are most familiar with. This is the mechanism that decides when we see information if it's important enough to hang on to. Now, there is some limitations found in the working memory. It can only hold 5 to 7 pieces of information for about 20 seconds. So if it does decide that it is something important enough that we want to hang on to, that's when it involves the schema. So think of the schema as an organizing system or an archival system. So what the schema does is it tries to kind of put this information into the proper place. So it kind of deciphers, do we already have a schema that we can build upon to add this information to, or do we need to actually create a new one? Now the schema actually resides in the long-term memory, but as you can see, it works very closely with the working memory as well. So the last component of the cognitive architecture is the long-term memory. So this is kind of our permanent storage area. There are no limitations here. So the second component of the cognitive load theory is what we call cognitive load. So there's 3 different types. Type number 1, the intrinsic cognitive load. So this is basically pertaining to the learning material itself and how complex it is. So if it's kind of a simple learning material to the learner, they would consider this then a low intrinsic load. If it was complex, maybe something they've never seen before or something of great difficulty, then we would consider this high intrinsic load. Type number 2, extraneous load. This is due to the way the material is presented. So if it's very clear cut, we can see it on the screen, for example, this would be considered low load on this particular type. If it is messy in terms of it's not very clear on the screen, or maybe the colors are off, or we can't really decipher it, the font's too small, then this would be high load. The last type, or type number 3, is the germane load, also known as the effective load. So this is basically pertaining to the learning process itself. So in regards to the goal of instruction, it's to make sure that you have appropriate intrinsic cognitive load, and by this we mean based on the learners that you're dealing with or encountering, and then you want to minimize those extraneous cognitive loads because we want to promote meaningful learning and we want to maximize it, and this is how we do that. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about theory number 2, which is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So what this theory examines is kind of the learning and the understanding that is acquired through the use of multimedia, and that can be words and pictures. And this is based on how humans process information. So there's a model that goes along with this particular theory, and this is basically a model that consists of 4 different pieces. So the first piece is the multimedia itself. So for this particular theory, we're looking at either pictures or words, and that's once again, component number 1. Component number 2 of this model is what we call sensory memory, and that's basically how we perceive the information that we're getting. So here, the sensory memory is our eyes or our ears. The next component is the working memory, and we just discussed that in the cognitive load theory, so it's the same premise here. And then the fourth component here is the long-term memory, which once again we just discussed. And the model makes the the jump that we go from the working memory to the long-term memory via that schema mechanism that we just spoke about. In addition, there are some assumptions that go along with this particular model. So the first assumption is what we call dual channels. So what this basically says is that we have two separate channels for the ears and for the eyes. The second assumption is limited capacity. And once again, we spoke about this when we talked about cognitive load theory. So this is that whole premise that we can obtain about 5 to 7 pieces in our working memory for about 20 seconds. Kind of the expansion in this model is since we have two separate channels, each one has its own working memory in this particular model. The last component is what we call active processing. The last assumption is active processing. This is where the active learner will select and organize information that is important enough into that working memory. And then obviously from there, it's going to be integrated into either an existing schema or it will kind of create a new one. And this will lead once again to that long-term memory, and that's what that active processing is. So how do these two models relate? Well, obviously you can see there's a lot of overlap in regards to the working memory, the long-term memory, and the schemas. So this model really kind of takes the cognitive load theory and really expands it. And the expansion is really into that sensory memory component, basically saying that we're bringing in new information, but we're bringing it in through our ears and through our eyes based on the multimedia that we're using. So how they basically relate is, once again, one kind of builds off the other. So I hope you have a better understanding now of cognitive load theory as well as the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.